이제 한국경영학회 Sbs문화재단의 공동포럼의 마지막 세션을 시작하겠습니다. 이번 세션의 주제는 Future of Capitalism으로 자본주의의 미래에 대한 논의로 구성되어 있습니다. 연세대학교 경영대학 이두원 학장님과 영국 유니버시티 칼리지 런던 마리아나 마추카토 교수님께서 수고해 주시겠습니다. 교수님들을 화면으로 만나시겠습니다.
Hello, everybody. My name is Duwon Lee, Professor of Economics at Yonsei University and Dean at College of Commerce and Economics at Yonsei University. Professor Matsukato, it's really nice to see you. Would you please introduce yourself
Thank you. It's wonderful
for the audience?
Sure. I am Mariana Matsukato. I am the professor of innovation and economic value at University College London, where I founded and direct the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose.
Great. As you know, this forum is co-sponsored by Korea Academic Society of Business Administration and SBS Foundation. And the theme of this session is the future of capitalism. As far as I know, Professor Matsukato has proposed many fresh ideas about the relationship between the public sector and the private sector. And I believe that she must be the best person to deliver a presentation on this issue. Professor Matsukato, you have 20 minutes for your presentation, and then it will be followed by Q&A.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and I'm really thrilled and honored to be here at the SBSD Forum. So what I'd like to speak about are really the key lessons from my recent book called Mission Economy, A Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism. Next slide, please. So the current moment that we're facing is one of an extreme wake-up call globally. We found ourselves completely unprepared to deal with a health pandemic. We did not manage globally to provide personal protection equipment to our frontline workers. We did not manage to reduce the digital divide so that children at home could continue to access their human right to education. And really crucially, we are not managing to vaccinate the entire world. In fact, we have what Dr. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, calls vaccine apartheid, where most of the vaccines are actually being hoarded by a very small group of countries. Next slide. And of course, we also know that this health pandemic has been on the back of another terrible crisis, which COP26 has been debating the last couple of weeks, which is the climate crisis. And here too, we're simply not moving at pace. We had a 16-year-old, Greta Thunberg, tell us 2 years ago, if your house is on fire, what do? Do you sit there and debate? Should I stay? Should I go? No, you get out quickly. And we're not moving at pace. And the IPCC report told us this summer that if we don't start moving much more at pace, urgently, getting out of a burning home, the climate change we are facing right now will become irreversible. Next slide. And we also know that global companies have, really in some ways been in trouble, and they're talking about how to change, but we're not really seeing the walk yet. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about the walk towards a different model of corporate governance. We have a lot of extraction happening globally, where something like $4 trillion has been used just to buy back one's own shares amongst the global 500 corporations globally. And this is why there's a lot of talk about bringing purpose and stakeholder value to the center of corporate governance instead of just maximizing shareholder value. But unfortunately, this isn't really changing. In fact, one of the reasons that we're not vaccinating the globe properly is that a lot of even large pharmaceutical companies continue to prioritize short-term profits and use intellectual property rights, so patents, as a way to extract rents. And this is not the moment, of course, to be doing this, given that what we really need with COVID-19 is collective intelligence and sharing of knowledge. Next slide. We also have, and this is what I've been talking about for years, a huge problem within our government institutions. In order to transform our growth model to be more inclusive and to be more sustainable, we can't just keep patching up the system with bandages. So either we have kind of a regressive attitude towards governments, the kind of Reaganite attitude, get out of the way. But the real problem is that at best, on the other side, we talk about the role of government as fixing market failures, putting patches on the system, investing in the gaps that are left by the private sector, research and development, or putting patches on climate change, maybe with a carbon tax. And these, of course, are needed, these patches, but they can't be done through patches. They need to be done through a market shaping, a market creating framework, not a market fixing one. Because if you're always fixing a system, you will, of course, always be too little, too late. Next slide. So really what the book talks about is how can we apply this ambitious, dynamic approach to organizational structure, to public-private partnerships that have real incentives for innovation and quality improvement, but all focused towards a goal, a common goal. And really the goals today have to be the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which every country, Korea, the United States, Italy, where I'm from, Brazil, every country has signed up to them. But we're not moving at pace on any of them. These are 17 broad goals, which I call challenges, which must each be turned into different types of moonshots, different types of missions. And to do this, I've been advocating with different governments that they actually implement a mission-oriented approach. So next slide, this is an example of how I made the case to the European Commission to begin with their challenge approach of inclusive and sustainable growth, but turn that into a targeted, ambitious mission that can actually be answered, yes or no, did we get there? And to foster as much intersectoral collaboration as possible. This is required so that we take missions outside of departmental silos, and then to really structure the tools on the ground, grants, loans, procurement, to foster as much bottom-up experimentation. Next slide, please. So here you see an example of two missions, one around carbon neutral cities, and another one around getting 90% of the plastic out of the ocean. And for each one of those, so many different sectors are required, whether it's real estate, construction materials, transport, software, and so on. Next slide. But what missions have to do is they must inspire. They must be bold and inspirational. They must have a clear direction. They must be ambitious while realistic. They must foster that cross-sectoral and interdisciplinary interaction. I repeat interdisciplinary because as an academic, it's not just about STEM subjects. We also need poets and the humanities to help us think about how we want to live in the future. And they especially need to be designed to drive multiple bottom-up solutions. The one-way, linear, top-down system kills innovation. We know that. And it's not about the state doing everything, but it's the state putting a direction on change and then fostering that bottom-up solutions. But this really means tilting the playing field, making sure that we have all the different policies and activities aligned in that direction. Next slide. And the European Commission has, on the back of my work, chosen 5 EU mission areas. We have the Horizon program now, which is 100 billion euros, which has a chunk of it dedicated to these missions. But of course, the real goal is to foster as much different investments amongst the private sector and public sector as possible. So providing that mission-oriented leadership can then crowd in other forms of finance. Next slide. So one of the things I've also been doing is convincing or helping governments transform their industrial strategies away from being a list of sectors to protect, instead of choosing sectors, which will always be a random list of sectors, choosing the problems that are being faced. So the UK government, with my work, decided on these 4 bold problems, challenges: clean growth, future of mobility, aging society, and the data economy. Next slide. And then transforming each one of those challenges into missions like the future of mobility one, which advocated for having a system of transport which was both congestion-free, but also 100% accessible by all people, including those with disabilities. So some of those bottom-up projects, of course, had to address the world of disabilities. Next slide. This also means that we need to transform our financial institutions like public wealth funds or public banks away from just giving subsidies, grants, and loans for companies to stay in place, but really be transformational. So I helped set up a new public bank in Scotland, which is a mission-oriented public bank, providing that patient long-term finance to those companies that are willing, I repeat, willing, because we must pick the willing, not pick the winners, willing to move with Scotland around its ambitious agendas, for example, digitalizing the National Health Service. Next slide. And I think all these lessons that I'm talking about are really key if we want to walk the talk of stakeholder value. As I mentioned, in places like the World Economic Forum, we talk about purpose, we talk about stakeholder value, but if we can't do it with the vaccine, well, when are we going to do it? But we must do it with our digital platforms, with health innovation, and of course with the sustainable growth path of clean technology. It's not enough to just invest in an area if we don't govern the process towards the common good. Next slide. And this is why people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Congresswoman in the United States, but many others, including myself, have been advocating, if we care about health for all, what does that actually mean for how we price drugs, for how we construct public-private partnerships, for how we stop allowing patents to lead to the kind of rent extraction I talked about before. Patents are fine, but they must be narrow, they must be weak, so easy to license, and they must be downstream, not upstream. If we have patents that are too upstream in the production process, that means that we are actually privatizing the research itself, which then hurts that kind of knowledge sharing that we require, and especially for developing countries, the needed imitation in that first stage to even learn how to produce and innovate in a particular area. Next slide. And I think also one of the interesting lessons from COVID-19 is that we're putting huge amounts of money into the system last minute because of the health pandemic. Well, we should be careful. Next time, let's make sure that we are actually investing in the needed resources like health systems in a more continuous, normal way, not just on the back of a pandemic where, again, it's too little too late. But also, there's an opportunity right now to really build back better, or build forwards better, an expression I prefer, by putting in conditionalities that are linked to the public funds that are helping certain types of companies in the aerospace industry, in the tourism industry, and all sorts of sectors that are really feeling the weight of a pandemic where we've been in lockdown for a long part of the last 2 years. And you see here the face of the French finance minister, because he actually put some strong conditions attached to the bailouts that were received by Renault, the car manufacturer, Air France. They had to commit to reducing their carbon emissions in the next 5 years in order to access that bailout. Similarly in Scotland, but also in Austria and Denmark, they put conditions that those countries that have become accustomed to using tax havens will not be able to access the recovery funds. And it shouldn't be seen as a stick. It should really be seen as a carrot. How do we make sure that instead of just flooding the system with liquidity, as we did after the financial crisis, or just giving out subsidies and guarantees, we actually work to construct the kind of public-private partnerships that got us to the moon, that argue no excess profits, and how to use prize schemes to move towards a direction of change, tilting the playing field, picking the willing, shaping markets, not just fixing them. Next slide. So I'm now done with my presentation, and really what I hope is that this idea of missions and moonshots allows us to really do capitalism differently, because the economy and markets are outcomes. There's no economic pressure being faced by anyone. The economy is an outcome of decisions that we make within private institutions, within public institutions, and especially how they relate one to another. So I really advocate for walking the talk of stakeholder value, but also within governments to transform the current remit, which is simply to fix markets. I believe we need to shape and co-create the markets of the future in order to tackle the challenges that we have. And again, we've all signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals. Those are the challenges. This is the moment to turn them into moonshots. Thank you so much.